a river. The width of a country lies ahead. 23 March 1945. Lower Rhine, the night is a furnace of artillery and drifting smoke. Out of that glare, a GMC DUKW noses forward without headlights, a truck in profile until the bow meets black water and keeps going. The Americans call it a duck. The Germans have no word for it yet. All their transport is mechanized, a lieutenant mutters, and the sentence feels smaller than the thing it names. The first DUKW settles bilge pumps chattering, and the propeller takes its bite. 5 to 6 miles an hour across the current, with 2.5 tons under tarps, then 50 on the far road, if it lives long enough to find mud. Shore batteries answer late, and then in sheets stitching a fence of tracers at a man's height. The DUKW ignores fences. Another eases into the wake, and another until the river acquires a rhythm rather than a crossing. The lieutenant steadies his glasses and tries to pin a flaw to the amphibian's lines, freeboard too low, steering lazy in chop, a ramp too slick to climb. He does not find it. A DUKW does not race. It repeats. That is worse. The sound is familiar and wrong. At once a GMC straight 6 clatter every German mechanic has heard in captured trucks now translated into water. Spray ghosts across the gunnels. A crewman thumps a gauge with a gloved knuckle. The coxswain feathers throttle as the bow lifts over another wake. The near bank is men and mud and discipline. The far bank is imagination becoming traffic. A bow kisses the east bank meadow. Tires softened for the ooze rise and bite. The driver reaches for the air valve, and the DUKW hardens its own feet. In the time it takes a flare to burn out boat, becomes truck again without ceremony. It lurches into darkness toward a road net that did not exist for it a minute ago. Behind it, the next DUKW is already aligning on the same patch of water, and the lieutenant's map, the one with bridges circled and pontoon sites penciled, goes soft under his thumb. They had counted bridges, they had not counted DUKWs. They had built their western wall out of water and explosives. On the German side, the problem was elegantly simple on paper: delay, and a trite and industrial enemy at the last serious barrier before the plains of northern Germany. Count the bridges, wire them to blow pre-range. The likely pontoon sites concentrate batteries where terrain squeezes a river into bends and narrows. Every mile the Rhine delivered a gift to the defense current eddies, steep banks mud that swallowed axles, and every blown span promised time. A staff officer in a cellar outside Wesel could run a pencil down a list and feel the comfort of finite things: so many bridges, so many ferries, so many engineer companies known by number. Time in that reckoning was purchasable with charges and steel. Across the water, the problem wore a different face. The Americans needed not a crossing, but a rhythm, because a single moment of audacity means little if the guns on the far bank fall quiet by afternoon. They had learned the lesson the hard way, on every coastline and river, from North Africa to Normandy, throughput beats heroics. It is a dull sentence until you are the man on a gun line staring at a stack of empty shell crates. So the task was defined in 3 nouns that tolerated no poetry, wait, water, waiting, and the solution had to press all 3 at once. Bridges would be thrown, yes, because bridges on maps comfort even the attackers. But bridges are concentrations, and concentrations attract fire and fate. The question became how to make a river behave like a road before the engineers finished making a road. The answer arrived ugly and deliberate and reproducible. A 6-wheel drive cargo truck, many thousands strong in the Allied order of battle, had been wrapped in a watertight hull and given a screw. Its axles would roll on shore, and its propeller would push in water, and there would be no pause where one was exchanged for the other. On a spec card, it seemed almost timid, roughly 5 to 6 miles an hour against the stream, roughly 50 on the hard surface beyond a 2.5-ton payload under canvas, and the same straight 6 heartbeat mechanics in every motor pool from Cherbourg to the Saar. The modesty of those figures was the point. War built on averages rewards machines that keep their promises. The amphibian kept them often enough that staffs could plan by it. Doctrine thickened around the machine, the way river water thickens with silt in spring. Amphibians would feed treadway bridges, which would feed Bailey spans, which would feed the road net the maps pretended already existed. The ducks were not a replacement for engineers, so much as an accelerant for them uncoiling capacity while the spans were still being laid. A battalion S3 could look at a mudbank fringed with smashed willows and schedule a Pulse 1 vehicle every few minutes. Lane discipline enforced by hand signals and throat mics supply points, warmed and ready 20 yards back from the waterline. In that scheme, the river's malice current chop wind was spread across dozens of entry points instead of piled upon one. The Germans sought to push the fight back into categories they understood. They mapped exit ramps, set mines where tires must climb, drilled their gunners to rake the lanes at a man's height with machine gun belts, and to walk artillery across the brighter wakes. They were not fools. They killed men and burned machines and bought hours. But they discovered a difference that mattered more than bravery. A bridge focuses, a flow diffuses. When a Bailey span goes down to a well-placed shell, a column halts. When one amphibian drowns under a flare-lit salvo, another is already nosing the same strip of black water, and the plan bends without breaking. On the American side, the constraint most feared was not enemy fire, but delay. Commanders had watched bold thrusts starve to stillness when their supply tails snagged on a collapsed span or a bank too soft to carry weight. The amphibians spoke directly to that fear in a small mechanical grace that read like a footnote and behaved like a principle. The driver could bleed down tire pressure for mud and pump it up again for road without leaving the seat. On a dry parade field, it sounded like trivia. On a Rhine meadow, it was the difference between burying an axle to the hub and walking a bow up the lip of ooze until rubber found purchase. When the first East Bank drivers reached for their valves and hardened their tires, while the hull still dripped, an entire category of waiting simply vanished. You did not queue for a prime exit ramp. You made one. An adversary eye could see the stakes in the smallest scenes. A German forward observer crouched behind a timbered loophole watches three silhouettes emerge sequentially from smoke, judges their speed in the way a hunter judges a bird on a headwind, and calls a correction to the battery net. One of the shapes takes a near miss and staggers, losing momentum. The second veers a yard and steadies. The third rides the wake and climbs the same scar of bank. The first carved open its tires low and fat, its nose lifting like a patient animal. The observer has trained himself to look for the one decisive place to shoot the single span, the single ferry point, and he cannot find it. He can make them bleed by the minute. He cannot make them stop by the hour. Behind him, a company runner arrives with a message from the engineers about a blown culvert on a lateral road. Traffic will be delayed. He understands the symmetry. On his side, a small failure halts a column. On theirs, a small success creates one. Numbers crept into every conversation because numbers stripped the romance and left the truth. Divisional G4s compared loads and minutes the way air officers compare sorties and fuel. A ferry lane that sustained a pulse of one amphibian every 3 to 4 minutes delivered a certain tonnage per hour multiplied by the number of lanes the enemy could not close. A Bailey span assembled in hours rather than days raised the ceiling further. But the ceiling mattered less than the floor. So long as a minimum cadence was kept, the modest 5 to 6 miles an hour on water translating reliably into deliveries on the far roads, the battle on the East Bank could proceed as if a river were a fact of geography rather than a veto of operations. The last piece was quantity cruel and decisive. The amphibian had been produced not as a curio, but as a population. A staff slide could carry the figure 21,147 with the same lack of drama the vehicle wore in its lines, and that too was the point. Engineering audacity wins headlines. Engineering normalcy wins wars. A machine that a sergeant can fix with the same spares he uses on his other trucks is a machine that can be counted on at dawn when the fog sits heavy and the battery needs fuses more than stories. On both banks, the stakes were identical and opposite. For the Germans, a river that remained a moat meant one more night to reorganize, one more day to bring up a reserve that existed more in memory than on the road. For the Americans, a river that behaved like a schedule meant guns that fired on time, fuel points that never ran dry before noon, and infantry that crossed dry enough to fight in the afternoon. Between those futures ran a dark sheet of moving water. The amphibian did not conquer it. Conquest is too pretty a word. It negotiated with it slowly, predictably, repetitively, until the negotiation became indistinguishable from victory. They began with a hull line that looked wrong to anyone who loved handsome ships. The bow was too blunt, the sheer nearly absent, the sides slabbed the freeboard modest. But the line had been drawn by people who understood that rivers do not reward pretty. They reward volume, stability, and forgiveness. The amphibian's skin sat over a frame that did not ask the world to be kind. Water crept into every plan because water always does. So the seams were sealed with the paranoia of boat builders, and then the paranoia was doubled with pumps. When a rifle round made a small steel mouth below the waterline, the bilge chattered awake and treated the intrusion as arithmetic. Holes had flow rates, pumps had capacities. Keep the second larger than the first, and the boat continued being a boat long enough to become a truck again. Under the floorboards, the familiar geometry of a truck persisted, as if insisting on its own dignity. A straight-through gearbox fed a transfer case with a choice axles propeller, or both. On the water, the driver's right hand lived on a short lever that clicked the screw into service. On the approach to a sticky bank, he could leave the prop biting, while 6 wheels turned, the hull pushing, and the tires clawing in the same breath. It looked awkward from shore, as if a creature were learning to walk and swim at once, but awkward is what competence looks like from far away. The propeller sat tucked beneath an armored shield, the shaft short to keep vibration honest. The rudder answered to a wheel like any truck's, but it also listened to the flow of the river through the driver's shoulders. Steering on water is a negotiation with delays. The amphibian forgave late decisions more gently than a boat, because the driver could always add tire to the bargain. The deck plan was a confession of purpose. Nothing ornamental, nothing proud. Tie-downs stamped into the steel at intervals. A shallow combing to keep cargo honest when a wave slapped. A transom that did not promise grace but offered a clean plane to climb a ramp or to lean a plank. The winch up front was not there for heroics. It existed to turn bad exits into plausible ones, and to make a single stuck hull into a brief inconvenience instead of a traffic report. Men who had spent a winter rescuing ordinary trucks from ordinary mud understood immediately that a cable and a good tree are worth more than cleverness. What lifted the machine from clever to useful was air. Tires too often treated as circles that happened to exist had been made into instruments. A control line ran from a manifold to each wheel. The driver could bleed pressure until the sidewalls softened like muscle, then reinflate them once steel met hardstand. On test days, an engineer would kneel at the bank with a notebook and write down the slope that a hard tire slid on, and the slope that a soft tire climbed. The delta was the size of the idea. On nights that counted, nobody wrote anything down. A driver glanced at the bank, at the sheen of the mud, at the trace of footprints, and let air out until his shoulders relaxed. The amphibian rose on its own compliance and walked out of the river, as if the bank had agreed to the arrangement beforehand. The numbers that officers loved were simple enough to print on a card and laminate. 5 to 6 miles an hour on the water if the current behaved, 50 on a hard road if the traffic police did not scowl. A load that matched the awkward poetry of 2.5 tons, which a sergeant would translate into crates and men and a single jeep if someone begged. Those numbers traveled with the machine like dog tags. They were not remarkable. That was their virtue. They remained true often enough that staffs could plan across the Rhine as if meetings with mud and wind were merely delays rather than verdicts. At eye level, the physics became human. A driver's knuckles were raw beneath thin gloves because steel wheels ask more honesty than wood ones. The engine note, that familiar American clatter, laid a thin metallic thread across the water that the men on both banks learned to hear as reassurance. A coxswain of no nautical training learned to time his throttle against the small, ugly waves that sound like broken glass on steel. When the bow lifted over the wake of another hull, the propeller lost its bite for a half second and then found it again, and every man aboard learned to breathe with that rhythm. On a good landing, you hardly felt the first touch of mud. On a bad one, the bow stuck, the stern swung, and the crew leaned their weight without being told, while the driver asked the machine to be both things at once, the screw still pushing the tires, already turning the air, hissing in the lines. The amphibian did not thank them. It simply complied. A German mechanic met the machine on a quiet morning after a barrage had had its say, and a hull had misjudged a flare-lit eddy. He ran his palms along the skin and frowned at how thin it was. He lifted a hatch and found the pump. He traced the shaft to the propeller and nodded at the economy of the arrangement. Nothing exotics, nothing to be revered or feared at the bench. He had hoped for some secret to explain the ache in his artillery's schedule. What he found was normalcy arranged for a river. In his notebook, he wrote the part numbers he could see and left the page otherwise blank. You cannot requisition against an idea. Training had been designed for men who were tired and bored in equal measure. Manuals spoke in a voice that anticipated stupidity and forgave it. Cadre showed where to stand, and more importantly, where not to stand. The first lesson on a river was to listen to it. The amphibian did not make fools immune to the consequences of hurry. It made consequences survivable if the fool knew how to reach for the air valve and the winch handle and the lever that changes water into road. It democratized competence. A platoon that had never seen surf could learn a river in a morning. A squad that had never spoken to an oar could disembark from steel onto pasture without learning a new language. The supply chain that fed the amphibian was not a special pleading to factories. That too was part of the design. The engine asked for the same plugs and gaskets that lived in warehouses along 1,000 miles of rear area. The axles matched. The filters were cousins of the ones every motor pool already cursed. When a driver limped off a bank and an axle seal wept, the repair was an annoyance rather than a dispatch to a depot. The machine's genius lay not in its parts, but in the way ordinary parts arranged with aquatic intent dissolved a category that an enemy had mistaken for a boundary. On the water, speed was never the point. Cadence was. A hull that held a course without drama made it easier for a shore party to wave the next one in. A driver who landed 3 yards too low and still climbed made it easier for the lane to remain a lane rather than a jam. A pump that tolerated a few new leaks saved a boat that would otherwise have become a story. The amphibian taught everyone near it to prefer repetition over flourish. You did not celebrate the crossing. You repeated it until celebration felt gauche. By the time the spring current hit its stride and the winds came down the river in long sighs that tried to push bows sideways, the design had shown what it meant by advantage. It did not outrun danger. It outlasted uncertainty. It offered planners a floor they could stand on while they built ceilings with bridges and roads and depots that would live longer than a single chilly night. A river cannot be argued with. It can be given tasks. Carry this crate for 10 minutes. Suffer this hull 20 yards farther. Accept this tire at this pressure. The amphibian's physics made those requests in a grammar the Rhine understood, and the river being a river complied just enough to lose the war. They tested the river the way miners test a seam, one cut, then another, then a line of cuts until the rock starts to tell the truth. In the first hour after midnight shore, parties marked the near bank with hooded lanterns and white rags pegged into mud that only mattered at dawn. Engineers with stopwatches worked in pairs, one at the waterline, one at the far tree line, calling times over throat mics in numbers that meant feed or hold, risk or wait. A single amphibian nosed into the current to prove a lane was viable. Another followed 3 minutes later to see if wake from the first helped or harmed. A third went wide to test the eddy that looked generous and usually wasn't. Field tests under fire are not tidy. They are conclusive. The river argued back in the language it knows, wind that slides the bow, just as a flare opens the sky, chop that steals the propeller's bite, a bank suddenly slick as glass. Drivers adjusted with the grammar they had learned keep the screw turning. Feel the delay between wheel and rudder, as a beat in the shoulders, bleed the tires softer for the last 5 yards, and then commit to the climb. On a good landing, the bow kissed mud, and the machine rose on compliant rubber before the prop wash died. On a bad one, the hull stuck sideways, and a winch cable sang under strain, while a second amphibian idled offshore waiting for the lane to clear. A platoon sergeant on the shoreline counted in threes. If the next bow did not show where the last had vanished, he moved the flags 20 yards, and the lane living, stubborn, practical shifted with him. The Germans watched the testing with a hunter's patience and a bookkeeper's pencil. At a bend near Wesel, a forward observer measured the silhouettes against range stakes hammered into sod months earlier. He laid a machine gun belt across the water at a yard's height, man-high river flat, then walked a battery in with corrections he could have given in his sleep. One amphibian lurched and slowed. Another veered to avoid the boil left by the first. The third climbed where the first had cut the lip into something tires could trust. The observer reported hits and adjustments and waited for the relief that comes when a lane closes. It did not close. 3 minutes later, the next bow appeared at the edge of smoke as if the river itself had decided to supply the Americans. Captured kit clarifies myths, so by noon of the next day, a damaged hull had been hauled into a farmyard behind the German line. The motor pool smelled like oil and wet canvas and frightened horses. A mechanic ran his hand along the steel and frowned at how thin it felt compared to a ferry's plate. He opened a hatch with a screwdriver and found the pump he had expected neat and mundane. The transfer case, though, made him pause, one output to axles, the other to the screw, a leash on torque that could be handed to water or road or briefly to both. He traced airlines down the arms to the wheels and followed one back to a control manifold inside the cab. The note he wrote for his captain was not a revelation. It was a sentence ordinary truck parts arranged to ignore a river. That afternoon, the river returned the favor by ignoring the plan. Wind freshened from the west, piling riffle over chop, so that bows lifted and fell out of rhythm, and the far bank turned from pasture to glue wherever shell bursts had watered it. The American answer was rehearsal without romance. Shore crews switched to the lanes that had proven false the night before. Traffic control points moved back 50 yards to keep the bank from becoming a parking lot of desperation. Radio nets stayed clean, voices clipped and local because logistics nets that babble turn minutes into arguments. A company runner yanked on a driver's sleeve and pointed at his tires with 2 flat palms. The driver nodded and bled his pressure lower, the amphibian settling like a beast that has decided to kneel before it stands. He touched the ramp with his bow and climbed as if the mud had signed a contract. Not every test ended in competence. A hull took a direct mortar hit near the stern and settled by the aft deck in a slow, stubborn refusal to surrender. Men scrambled onto the bank, hauling crates the last 6 yards by hand, while another amphibian idled a respectful distance away, unwilling to churn men into the bank with its prop wash. The bilge did what it could against the new hole, buying minutes that mattered, because a second lane kept feeding while the drama played out. That was the unglamorous miracle, not invulnerability, but redundancy. The tests had never been about finding a perfect path. They were about seeding enough good ones that loss became local rather than general. At eye level, the adversary's realization came in flashes. A lieutenant who had convinced himself the exit ramps were the choke saw, a driver ignore the obvious ramp nose into cattails and make his own tires whispering against ooze until they found something firmer and rose. A battery commander who had wagered on the pontoon sites saw traffic continuing on farm lanes that didn't exist on his map, carrying loads straight past the places his guns had been told to rake. A pioneer corporal stood over a mine he had set at a likely landing and watched the amphibian take a line 3 yards upriver, touch its bow where he hadn't considered, and climb out with a shrug. Doctrine that depends on prediction hates systems that depend on options. Somewhere behind the smoke, the Americans ran their own examination. An engineer captain, soaked and irritated, kicked the hull of a machine that had needed too much coaxing and made a note to relocate that lane 2 tree lengths east because the bank there had roots and the mud here didn't. He wrote down times entry to exit water to road and drew a line through a number when a driver got bold and created a jam by trying to overtake on water, which is as foolish as it sounds. He walked 100 yards and told a corporal to turn his platoon around and feed a different lane entirely. The corporal did not argue because the river had already taught him that habit is the enemy of cadence. The interim admission, never formal, never written, passed through German positions like weather. This will not be stopped everywhere at once. You could shut a lane with a lucky salvo or a well-placed mine. You could scorch a bank so badly that exit points had to be abandoned. You could hammer a bridge span into the river and watch the enemy's traffic snarl for an hour that felt like victory. But the amphibians made the river bigger than your plan and smaller than your fear at the same time. Bigger because they used more of it than you could cover. Smaller because each crossing was 10 minutes of water and 20 minutes of road multiplied until arithmetic looked like destiny. Near Rhine, just before midnight, a German forward observer tried one last time to compress the chaos into a single solvable problem. He plotted lights, counted seconds between bows, aligned a battery's fire to comb the surface like teeth. For 10 minutes, the river seemed to submit. Then a flare drifted sideways, and in the softer dark, 3 amphibians slipped past where the pattern was supposed to catch them. The observer wrote his correction anyway, because that is what he was for, and the guns obeyed, and shells walked the water where the last silhouettes had been rather than where the next would be. He understood finally what the tests had taught the other side: not speed, not stealth, repetition. The river could be forced to respect men who insisted on doing the same simple thing well enough, often enough, under punishment. By dawn, the lanes had names that only the men who worked them knew: Poplar Churchyard Wagon Cut, and the captured hull in the farmyard had yielded no secrets worth more than 10 minutes of sleep. On the east bank, trucks that had been boats 3 minutes earlier were already disappearing into a road net that drew itself while they drove it. If the Germans had written a formal line for their war diary that morning, it would have sounded like confidence. Off the record among men, the admission was shorter and heavier: they keep coming. Reliability in war is never a single part. It is a temperament taught to machines and men until both behave under stress. The amphibian's temperament began at the waterline with boredom, disguised as discipline. Before first light, shore crews walked the lanes with poles, tasting depth and mud the way bakers test dough. Drivers checked the same list even when nothing had broken. Plug caps seated bilge strainers, clear winch cable flaked clean air manifold hissing only when asked. A vehicle that worked yesterday was treated as a rumor until it proved itself again today. That habit repetition without apology was why the river gave up its hours. Training took the edge off fear by making error survivable. Manuals were plain and unromantic, the diagrams drawn for a corporal with cold hands, not for a school. A recruit learned to keep the screw turning on approach and to resist the land-born instinct to steer like a car. He learned the lag between wheel and water and how to time it, how to point the bow 2 yards above the true exit and let the current pull him down onto the mark. He practiced bleeding his tires until the sidewalls looked indecently soft, then putting the air back the moment road replaced meadow. A decent driver could fake courage for 10 minutes. A trained one did not need to. On the third night, when wind clawed broadside and flares drifted lower than anyone liked, the trained drivers made the difference between a lane that held and a story told later about why it failed. Radios made the river conversational. A platoon net stayed clean because men were reminded hourly that chatter turns minutes into arguments. Call signs were short corrections, shorter. When a lane silted at the lip and exits began to bog, the shoreline mic snapped once and the next 3 hulls shifted to Poplar instead of Churchyard. When a battery on the far bank reported that its morning allotment had arrived at 0900 rather than noon, the word came back down the net as a tone of voice rather than a boast, and the lane chiefs pushed harder without saying they were. Discipline on the air made discipline in the water look easy. If a driver drowned, his radio hand signals took over, square and emphatic. If smoke hid the hands, a whistle in sets of 3 told him what the river wanted next. Fuel lived close without being foolish. You could not put drums at the lip and hope to keep them through a bombardment. You could not place them so far back that hoses became suggestions. Shore parties staked a compromise into mud, 100 yards off the waterline, hose reels warm under blankets. The amphibians that claimed the first hours after midnight returned on their second runs to find fuel where memory expected it. Nothing makes a machine lie like a dry tank. Nothing keeps a schedule honest like a full one. The doctrine that paired amphibians with treadways and bailies had a line most men never read because they lived it: keep the refuel short, keep the traffic moving, never let a lane think it has time to rest. On the German side, the logic of defense tried to keep up with a form that refused to sit still. Mines were replanted at new exit scars. Machine guns were dragged 200 meters to catch the place where bows had started to touch at odd angles. Batteries shifted their sheaves a degree or two, and found for an hour the old comfort of predictability. At eye level, a Feldwebel leaned into a periscope and watched an amphibian slide sideways in an ugly gust, certain he would see panic bloom and a driver overcorrect into failure. Instead, the bow eased, the propeller kept biting, the tires touched earlier than the map said they should, and the machine climbed with a grunt that read as contempt. The defender filed his correction and swallowed the knowledge that a system with options cannot be trapped by a single cleverness. Then they realized the amphibian's most dangerous quality was modesty. It was never the fastest boat or the strongest truck. It was the thing that accepted poor choices and made them work well enough. A path that would have humiliated a ferry too shallow for a proper keel, too sticky for a ramp, became a workable exit when 6 tires could be convinced to float on mud and a winch could take the remaining insult. A driver operating at the edge of his nerves could still succeed because his machine carried 2 or 3 small Mercies in reserve, a pump that forgave a few new holes, an air system that turned clay into support, a transfer case that let water push and rubber pull at the same time. The river did not reward brilliance. It rewarded persistence with the right tools. Maintenance expressed itself as hygiene rather than heroics. Between runs, crews walked the hulls with the same suspicious eyes medics use on wounded men who say they are fine. A loose clamp that would become a leak at 0300 was tightened at 2300. A frayed winch cable was replaced in a curse and a minute. If a seal wept a rag, and a note settled the matter until daylight. Most problems were solved small while they were still small. The amphibian was built to encourage that style of care, parts that matched other trucks, pieces that could be swapped in the time it takes an argument to get started. Nothing so precious that a tool thrown in anger would ruin it. Doctrine did not flatter the machine. It used it. Staffs stopped asking a river to become a bridge and started asking it to become a schedule. The amphibians were lanes in a timetable. Engineers published hour blocks to the far bank dumps and accepted that the blocks would slip by minutes rather than by days. If a span went in ahead of plan, the ducks fed it. If a span went down to a bright blossom of steel in the water, the ducks steadied the pulse until a new one took its place. The question on the far side stopped being, "Can we cross?" and became, "How reliably can we continue?" The answer was never a boast. It was a shrug that contained a calendar. At least once each night, the adversary's eye-level view caught a private truth. A German runner slogging toward a battery with a message mislaid by wire flinched at the sound that had become the night's metronome, that thin clatter of an American straight 6 crossing water where no road exists. He watched a bow lift against a wash of light and then vanish into the dark on his side, and he felt the strange sensation of a plan failing inside a noise rather than a blast. He reached the battery and found the guns already adjusting to a more modest mission, harass delay tax. The big words deny stop had evaporated at the edge of the lanes. By dawn, the proof that it worked in the wild looked like a lack of drama. The log at a far bank fuel point had no gaps larger than a coffee break. The artillery park's morning stacks grew in neat, ungenerous pyramids. The infantry arrived dry enough to fight before lunch. The river was still a river. Men still died. Hulls still failed. But the amphibians had made the barrier into a variable, and variables can be managed. The generals would remember the map arrows and the dates stamped bold. The men who touched the steel would remember smaller certainties, the first hiss of air leaving a tire before a climb, the way a bow settles when the screw finds its water again, the habit of seeing the next lane even when the current has just stolen this one. They had counted bridges. They were counting differently now. They kept the river on a clock until the clock became the story. By first light on 24 March 1945, the lanes had settled into something that looked like indifference to danger, bows appearing out of ash-gray smoke at dependable intervals, crews moving in practiced economy shore parties, waving the same square signals they had waved in the dark. The turning came not as a banner, but as a number written in pencil on a damp clipboard. 1 amphibian, every 3 minutes per lane payload, 2.5 tons, which is 20 movements an hour, which is 50 tons per hour per lane when the pencil stops smearing. At Wesel and Rhine, where 3 and then 4 lanes ran without a long pause, the arithmetic did not ask to be believed. It insisted. 200 tons per hour began crossing a river that doctrine had defined as a moat. On the near bank, the cadence looked almost lazy. Engines idling at a note that meant work without rush drivers, tapping gauges, a corporal lacing a winch cable back into a neat figure 8. On the far bank it sounded like inevitability, tires kissing mud, and then hardening under air tarps, lifting just long enough to show the shape of crates, and then dropping as the truck that had been a boat rolled toward roads the map had not promised yesterday. The Germans could hit a hull, and they did. They could rake a lane, and they did. They could cut a bridge, and they did somewhere with a blossom of water and steel that men watched and did not admire. None of that broke the number. When one lane faltered, traffic slid to another. When an exit scar turned to glass, drivers bled more air and accepted the insult. 50 tons an hour per lane was not heroism. It was policy. A staff captain on the American side watched the figure hold for 2 consecutive hours and then made the only decision that matters. In a pursuit, he stopped asking permission. Batteries east of the river logged morning allotments delivered not at noon but at 9. A fuel point reported that its first lull came at Euro 9:20 and lasted 9 minutes, which is to say there was no lull at all. A division quartermaster stopped apologizing for priorities and started promising windows in the afternoon. On radios that had carried only corrections and lane changes through the night, the new words sounded obscene in their confidence: proceed, sustain, continue. Across the water, a German observer flattened his cheek against cold steel and tried to make the river coherent by narrowing it to a single solvable problem. He tuned his mind to the old geometry bridge span ferry point and found himself assaulted by arithmetic. Trucks that were boats presented themselves not in column, but in sequence minutely spaced, demanding the kind of interdiction that requires more shells than time supplies. He shifted his battery sheaf a degree east to catch the brighter wakes. He lifted and dropped the curtain of machine gun fire at a height that had worked at midnight. The silhouettes adjusted by habit, not by brilliance. A bow appeared 2 yards higher than the last. Another seemed to hesitate, and then did not. The observer, who had been trained to love predictability, felt a new emotion creep into the periscope: boredom with failure. The inflection could be graphed in a single supply trace. The artillery regiment north of Wesel had been living on a rationing table that translated into fewer rounds per target than honesty would like. By late morning, the stacks behind their guns forgot to shrink. Ammunition came across as if the river were a side street. Forward battalions that had been warned to conserve fuel eased their throttles without confession. The East Bank traffic control posts began to look less like heroic beachheads and more like ordinary intersections where the chalk on a blackboard kept being replaced by fresh chalk and more orders for more chalk. Men who had learned not to trust good luck trusted the clock instead. Then they realized why the number humiliated them. Bridges deliver capacity as a step function. You have nothing until you have a span, and then you have everything until someone takes it away. The amphibian delivered capacity as a slope. It started small, 1 hull, 1 lane, 1 truck, brave enough to become 2 things in sequence, and it climbed every hour until it was impolite to pretend you could starve it. When 1 Bailey span twisted under a heavy load, and the river swallowed a breath of steel and cursing the slope did not dip to 0. Tonnage bent and then straightened. Somewhere in a cellar, someone shouted for more shells at the right place, the right angle, the right second. The right second belonged to the lanes. At eye level, the moment when doctrine turned into reality was almost indecently plain. A driver who had been dry for only 10 minutes slid out of his seat to stretch and looked back at the water he had crossed twice already that morning. It did not look like a barrier. It looked like a task he would repeat until told to stop. He wiped mud from a placard that did not care about poetry, gross weight, payload, tire pressure, and felt affection for its honesty. A German runner passing a timbered loophole winced as a shell he could not see cracked the air over the river, and then swallowed the fact that the crack had changed nothing. He did not slow down. He had learned that today speed did not belong to him. By midday, the corps front east of the river behaved like an army that had never seen water. The fighting did not soften. The killing did not decline. The weather did not improve. But the specific fear that haunts every advance, the fear of starvation by delay, retreated. A battery asked for more and received it. An engineer battalion called for plank and float, and was told that deliveries would not be scheduled because they were ongoing. An infantry regiment rotated companies across lanes with the indifference of men crossing a street in peacetime. The number on the clipboard held steady enough that officers stopped checking it every hour. That indifference was the victory. The Germans did not quit that day. They fell back on ground that did not argue with them and wrote entries that sounded dutiful and full. But in the privacy of dugouts, where men warmed their hands over stoves that smelled of stolen fuel, sentences shortened. Plans hedged. A captain stopped talking about denying a crossing and started talking about taxing one. He had learned a mathematician's humility. He had also learned a soldier's truth. The moment when a barrier becomes a route is not clarioned. It is counted. The Rhine had been a moat. It now behaved like a schedule. By evening, the shock line from the first night returned quieter and more final. They had counted bridges. The river had been taught to count something else. The river did not congratulate anyone for crossing it. By the last week of March, the banks were trampled into a widening geography of ordinary things, fuel points that never quite ran dry, stacks of crates that forgot to shrink traffic posts, chalking arrows that pointed east. Units that had spoken in the grammar of ferries and tauas switched back to roads and times. The bridgeheads took on the homely look of permanence even when nothing about them was safe field. Kitchens smoked in the lee of shattered willows, clerks wrote returns that assumed deliveries, and engineers who had lived on adrenaline for nights fell into a trot that could last months. When a river ceases to be an event, the campaign that follows remembers how to breathe. The consequence was not mystical. Once the crossings behaved like a schedule, the fight turned into arithmetic on a larger map. Divisions that had been obligations on the West Bank became options on the East. Fuel ceased to be a rumor and became a route. Artillery plans fattened into barrages that did not apologize. Bridges multiplied where lanes had first made the case that waiting was a choice. The encirclement of the Ruhr tightened with the quiet violence of logistics, done well roads that fed more roads, dumps that spawned forward dumps, columns that did not pause long enough to become targets. There was still killing in every wood and town. April would prove that. Yet the texture of the killing changed when the guns behind it did not have to count their shells twice. On the German side, the diaries adapted before the orders did. A staff officer near Xanten wrote with professional calm about persistent amphibious traffic, as if he were reviewing a municipal ferry line. A battery commander railed less at enemy cunning and more at his own shortages. A pioneer company reported mines replanted and then walked around again by a machine that could choose a worse path and make it work. Men who had measured their world in bridges and spans found themselves working in lanes and minutes instead, and it did not flatter them. They were competent in the wrong direction. Their artillery could still bite. Their counterattacks could still sting. Their maps were still beautiful. But every hour that the amphibians kept their pulse eroded a little more of the premise that water could buy time. At eye level, the legacy felt smaller and more intimate. A driver who had crossed 4 times in one morning found the gesture of reaching for the air valve becoming a reflex as ordinary as checking a mirror. He no longer marveled that rubber could learn to float on mud. He expected it. An engineer sergeant who had once loved bridges the way a mason loves walls admitted to himself that a river was best treated like a duty roster assigned lanes. Watch for absences replaced the missing keep the watch. The amphibian did not make men brave. It made their bravery cumulative. When courage repeats without demanding applause, armies move. The machine's own afterlife proved the point it had made in war. It was easy to preserve a few for parades and summer lakes, to let children climb the gunnels and laugh at the word duck painted forward of the cab. That sentiment was harmless and even deserved. But the truer inheritance lived in places no one applauds, in doctrines that prefer redundancy to brilliance, in engineers who draw supply as flow rather than as single spans, in drivers who teach their hands to make small, boring corrections that keep a column from becoming a story. The amphibian's genius had never been speed or strength. It had been an insistence that categories were conveniences, not laws. Truck when it helped boat, when it mattered both, when the bank argued. Some men on the far bank would carry stranger souvenirs. A gunner remembered the thin metallic thread of a straight six crossing water where no road existed. An officer remembered the way a bow kissed mud and the tires hardened under air with a sound like a decision. A medic remembered that the worst crossings were the quiet ones, because quiet meant men were saving their breath for later. The river itself kept no account. It returned to barges, to tourists, to 1,000 private mornings. Only in certain light, when wind lays a rib on the surface and the bank turns the color of old brass, does the meadow start to look again like an exit ramp that never had the dignity of a sign. For the defenders, the lesson was not humiliation, but correction. They had been trained to trust geometry, blow the span rake, the ferry mass, the guns. They learned too late for them, but in time for history, that arithmetic will sometimes win where geometry cannot. A slope of capacity, one hull, one lane, one more, can blunt a strategy built on thresholds and steps. When the West Bank became yesterday and the East Bank became routine, the great river of Europe lost its veto. That is not romance. It is record. By April, the campaign no longer spoke in the tense of rivers. It spoke in towns taken and armies pocketed in road nets that behaved and weather that sometimes did not. Yet the cadence that made those sentences possible began in the dark, with bows sliding off mud, and into black, with bilge pumps chattering with tires, learning to be soft and then to be hard. The men who lived it did not require the language of miracles. They preferred the language of clocks, and so the closing beat returns to the opening shock, quieter, now corrected by days of work. 23 March 1945. Lower Rhine had announced a shape no one in the dugouts had a word for. The word arrived painted in block letters on steel and spoken in a nickname that sounded like a joke until it stopped being one. They had counted bridges. They had not counted DUKWs.